good evening, one and all. It's good to see you here in the space this evening. And I'm most pleased to welcome you to the Howard L. Harrod Lecture that was established to honor Harrod, the Oberlin Alumni Professor of Social Ethics and Sociology of Religion. Professor Harrod, who died in 2003, was on our faculty for some 34 years. He wrote widely with several books devoted to ethics and to Native American religions and cultures. The Harrod Lectures, which began in 2004, are intended to deal with aspects within any of the three general fields of Harrod's interests: social ethics, sociology of religion, and Native American religions and cultures. This year's Harrod Lecturer is Professor Heather R. White, who since 2015 is visiting assistant professor in the Gender and Queer Studies program of the University of Puget Sound. White's work focuses on histories of religion and queer activism in the 20th century United States. They are an author of, and this is a book title, Reforming Sodom, Protestants and the Rise of Gay Rights, 2015, and co-editor with Bethany Morton and Jillian Frank of Devotions and Desires, Histories of Sexuality and Religion in the 20th Century United States, published in 2018, as well as numerous other shorter works which address topics ranging from Little Nas X, Satan's Shoes, to how heterosexuality became a religious value. Last year, White was a research associate and visiting faculty member in the Women's Studies in Religion program at Harvard Divinity School. They have also held visiting positions at New College of Florida and Vassar College. Tonight, Dr. White's topic is Gay Liberation Goes to Church, the Stonewall Movement's space-sharing arrangements with an Episcopal parish. After their lecture, we will have time for questions and answers, and after that, all are invited to a reception in the atrium just outside the door. Please please join me in welcoming, I do know how to talk. I just want you to know. Please join me in welcoming Professor White back to Vanderbilt Divinity School and the university.
It is good to be back. I was here, let's see, I don't even remember the years, maybe 7 years ago? Yeah, for a couple of summers in a row for the HRC summer program. And that time was really formative for me. And there's a number of folks in the room. Ellen, so good to see you. Laurel, good, and Emily Towns, another person who was a participant in that, and just so formative to have as scholars and mentors around me. I want to thank Monique Moultrie also for being here tonight. There's faces in the room, and I know some more folks who are watching on live stream, that it's just so good to be among you. And thank you in particular to Shatika Brown, who just made it all possible for facilitating all the nuts and bolts. And name all the people. And my partner, Casey Bitterman, who was in the back, waving like a diva. So the title for this talk is, as you see, Gay Liberation Goes to Church. And the title is a riff off of another title that was from an article written in Come Out, which was the newsletter of the New York Gay Liberation Front. And that other title was Young Lords Go to Church. That article was about the Young Lords which was a Puerto Rican activist organization sort of modeled after the Black Panthers. And in December of 1969, after a long period of negotiation with the congregation and the pastor of First Spanish United Methodist Church in Harlem, the Young Lords took it over. And they occupied the church for almost 2 weeks, from December of 1969 through early January of 1970. They renamed the First Spanish United Methodist Church, they renamed it the People's Church, and began using it as a food distribution center, a liberation school, and a gathering place to serve the neighborhood's predominantly Puerto Rican and Black community. So participants in the Gay Liberation Front, which had just started getting organizing in July of that same year, July of 1969, they visited the People's Church to check it out while this occupation was taking place. And the author of the article that was published in Come Out, the author of Young Lords Go to Church, was Martha Shelley, who was white, Jewish, and a lesbian, and one of that contingent that was visiting. So the article was a detailed report on both the occupation and what the Young Lords were doing with this church. Just all the things going on. And literally, she was taking notes, right? Because she was really interested in how this space was being transformed from a conventional, sort of more church, focus on Sunday services space to a community center that had most of the traffic coming in through the week, right? That was being used to serve the surrounding community. So she closed this article with a whole series of questions, and there's two of them that I think really resonate, not only for thinking about how that experience framed the Gay Liberation Front's relationship with this church that I'm going to tell you about, but these questions are also really vital today. And they're super simple. How could we serve our people with a community center? What could the Gay Liberation Front do with a church, right? I love that. What could we do with the church? And Martha Shelley was visiting the Young Lords and the People's Church as the Gay Liberation Front was just a few months into their own relationship with a church. In this case, they didn't have to take it over by force. The congregation and the pastor had agreed with a space-sharing arrangement. So they were paying a nominal, they called it a cost-sharing fee, that offset some of the church's own expenses. But this group of political radicals was having their regular Sunday evening meetings there in the parish hall of Holy Apostles. And Holy Apostles was an Episcopal church located at the far northern edge of the Manhattan neighborhood of Chelsea. Well, if you go there today, I'll say it's much fancier than it was then. In that day, it was a declining industrial no man's land with a towering expanse of new city-developed housing projects that had just been, many of them, just built within the past decade. So the Gay Liberation Front was just one of an increasing number of gay groups that began holding meetings and events in this space in 1969 during a slice of time that has since become iconic in the memory of LGBT activism. It was in the aftermath of that grassroots sort of riots in Greenwich Village that we now call the Stonewall Riots, which took place in the summer of 1969. And I'll say a little more about those in a minute. But it was in the wake of this event, it was in the wake of those riots in Greenwich Village that Holy Apostles was beginning to serve as a community center of sorts, an incubator of sorts for this growing movement. Shelley's question, so as she was writing back about this visit to the People's Church in East Harlem, the questions that she was asking were still radically open. Because all of this, the Gay Liberation Front was still looking for a community center. They had just started holding meetings in Holy Apostles Parish Hall just a few months before. And so it was in this context that Shelley was asking, how could we serve our people with a community center? what could we do with a church? So at that point, she didn't know, right, what the answer to those questions were. And the answers to those questions, what the Gay Liberation Front did with the church, how that church served as a kind of gay community center on the ground, opens up a really different picture of gay liberation and the Stonewall movement as we often hear about it. And it focuses our attention as well on how and why space matters. Right? We're here in the space, so how and why space matters is certainly a question that should interest us. By focusing on that seemingly background issue of space, the rooms, the buildings, the furnishings, what happens in them, what this does is uncover not only some of the previously overlooked parts of Stonewall, but also it brings into view the forgotten history of this congregation and how it provided the infrastructure for community building in that moment right after the riots. The church provided, and I think a way to think about it is provided the physical infrastructure for a radical vision of identity pride that was still taking shape at this moment. The politics of gay pride, which are today like almost immediately associated with what we think about the Stonewall riots, were still emerging as a way to think about homosexuality, and even the fact that they were using the word gay as a phrase to talk about the movement as a sort of new umbrella term, as opposed to the earlier movements phrasing, they talked about the homophile organizations which had preceded those gay liberation groups and some of those later gay groups. And there was also a lot of the use of the word homosexual to talk sort of generally and broadly about the groups that were stigmatized based on both sexual attraction and in many ways also to talk about gender non-normative behavior as well. So all of these groups were sort of cohering as a community, as a group that thought of themselves as a shared identity in this moment after Stonewall, while meeting in the same space of this church. So this space sharing history gives us a different picture of gay pride, gives us a different picture of the involvement of this religious group in this moment, but it also highlights the material connections within a history of talking about religion and the emergence of queer movement identities that are often narrated through different kinds of spatial metaphors. And here's where I'm going to draw a little bit on some theorists of space who have helped me really think about, what is it that we're talking about when we're looking at space? So often, the way that the relationship between queerness and religion is narrated as a concrete abstraction, as something, to use Lefebvre's words, that doesn't actually have a material connection to something on the ground. And the way that we often hear about queer movements, it is as if they represent the outside of religion, right? Somewhere outside of religion, and their inclusion, also a spatial metaphor, somehow changes the fundamentally non-queer, non-secular, anti-modern core of tradition that is somehow cloistered and protected from that outside. I see that kind of language even if we're reading about news reporting on some of the recent changes in the Methodist Church, for example. So there's a lot of ways that there's a knee-jerk reliance on the sense that religion is somehow protected from this outside that queer movements are connected to and represent. The theologian Mark Jordan, sort of tongue-in-cheek, talks about it as if queer movements are attacking churches from outer space as extraterrestrials, right? Just like, as if these two things did not come into contact. These dynamics of institutional change are narrated through abstracted metaphors about spatial locations. So the question and the thing that the Lefebvre helps bring in is that that's a decontextualized abstract representation, but there is an underpinning there that is actually spatial. And an important part of the analysis is to look for the connection between the material geographies of people and movements in their relationship to space and to think about how that changes the way that we imagine those spatial relations. In this case, how we might remap the decontextualized oppositional queer versus religion framing by looking at contextualized, and the phrasing that I like, intimate co-dwelling of bodies and objects, which is phrasing that comes from queer philosopher Sarah Ahmed's work, Queer Phenomenology, who does a lot of thinking about how, not only how space is bossy. For a while, like one of the things I was going to talk about if we had been meeting in the Benton Chapel is you really see bossy space when you're in church space, right? Because the pews don't move, the pulpit is there in the center, that's where the word is preached and spoken, and the pews are facing forward, fixed where you are to listen, and it's not going to be comfortable, right? Or it's not going to be comfortable, especially after a while, right? You can't easily turn around. And it's really interesting to be here in a multi-purpose space where everything here moves. Really different kind of space and a really different way of thinking about what happens in that space. And that reflects the intentionality of the group of folks, the designers, the architect, the committee who had some say about what should happen in that space. So the design that we might notice, the bossiness of the way a space directs our bodies, also reflects the intentions of the people who put it together, right? Who wanted to think about what kind of relationships it facilitated, what kind of interactions it facilitated. So Ahmed looks a lot about that, and also she looks at what happens when new bodies enter a space and when groups inhabit a space in a way for which it was not intended. And for Ahmed, this is the hope for a new kind of transformation, that bodies ordinarily might take the shape of the spaces they occupy, and the flow of their interactions follow the shape of that space. But what happens when new bodies show up, when bodies take up spaces that they were not intended to inhabit? And there, Ahmed tells us, something other than the reproduction of the facts of the matter happens. And I think thinking about what happens when new bodies interact in new spaces especially for which they were not intended, thinking about how transformations ensue. So with that, I'll say it was about 15 years ago, probably, that I first heard mention of Holy Apostles. And I was beginning, Holy Apostles, again, is up there near Penn Station. This is a small map of New York, 28th Street and 9th Avenue. This other star is the Stonewall Riots, where the Stonewall Riots took place in Greenwich Village, and that's the Stonewall Inn. So they're about a mile from each other. The Stonewall Inn is, of course, in the center of queer and bohemian life in the village, and up there is mostly industrial projects at that point. And it was about 15 years ago that I first heard mention of Holy Apostles, and I was beginning research on a dissertation project that since became the book, Reforming Sodom, and I was just starting to do interviews, and one of the first people I talked to was the Reverend Roy Burchard, who was an early advocate for gay and lesbian inclusion in the United Church of Christ, and also a founder of the Metropolitan Community Church of New York. These two publicly known roles were the reason for the interview. I wanted to find out more about the start of these Christian movements for LGBT inclusion. But of course, these two roles had a backstory. And Roy was telling me about that backstory, telling me about driving into New York City in 1970 from Madison, Wisconsin, to join the gay revolution. This movement, as you all may know, was growing and spreading in the aftermath of the incident that is now famously known as the Stonewall Riots. The riots took place in the late June of 1969 when the New York Police Department raided a bar in Greenwich Village called the Stonewall Inn. Police, of course, routinely raided gay bars, not so much because homosexuality and cross-gender expression were directly illegal, but because a whole thicket of city ordinances and other kinds of laws made it effectively illegal to own or manage public venues that permitted same-sex affection or cross-gender expression. It put a legal chokehold, effectively, on gay public space. Quasi-illegal things can also be very profitable, though. So you can see here, like, gay prohibition corrupts cops and feeds mafia. So one of the things that was taking place in the kind of spaces that were available is that most, if not all, of the existing gay nightclubs in New York were owned and managed by organized crime. And they had quasi-legal sort of conditions, payoffs to police that made it possible for these sites to exist, but also translated into the ongoing legal vulnerability of anyone who patronized them. And this particular bar, the Stonewall Inn, advertised itself codedly as colorful, which acknowledged its gay, gender nonconforming, people of color, patronage. During this particular incident of police intrusion, something unexpected took place. Patrons of the bar, onlookers outside on the streets fought back, and the spontaneous rebellion sparked a week of continued riots as protesters took over the streets of Greenwich Village with shouts of gay power. This incident quite quickly galvanized a new wave of activism with the founding that summer of the Gay Liberation Front, followed by a succession of other activist groups, including the Gay Activist Alliance later that fall, and a number of other groups as well. So Roy was telling me about arriving to New York in 1970, and he was telling me in particular about the first meeting that he attended at the Gay Activist Alliance. And it was almost as an aside, he was telling me about arriving, and almost as if this was something I might already have known. It's like, oh, the meeting was taking place at the Church of the Holy Apostles in that parish hall that everyone was using. At the parish hall that everyone was using, at the Church of the Holy Apostles. So that sort of, I even look back on my interview with him, and there were moments when I'm like trying to just keep up and ask questions, because I was interested in the overlap between the different religious groups, and they were all meeting in the same space. So a lot of that was sort of backtracking and telling me a little more. The location itself was not the point of the story that Roy initially was trying to convey to me, but our conversation prompted a whole trail of questions that, again, I would not have known to ask, because this was entirely a new piece for me. And here's what I found out, both through conversations with Roy and subsequent efforts to find out who were these groups that were using this space. So the Church of the Holy Apostles was sort of informally, in some places, called the Community Center, and from 1969 to 1974, but the bulk of that was 1969 to 1972. This is a list of groups that were meeting there: the Gay Liberation Front, the Gay Activist Alliance, Gay Youth, which started a little bit later. There were also homophiles, and those earlier organizations meeting there as well: the West Side Discussion Group, the New York Mattachine Society. There was an early fledgling attempt to start a New York Council on Religion and the Homosexual there, which was interesting. And then the Daughters of Bilitis and the Radical Lesbians would work together to create dances for women. Early on, there was also the Student Homophile League had an all-college gay dance in the parish hall of this church because they could not get the space for the dance at either NYU or Columbia. So these institutions of higher education wouldn't allow gay people to openly dance, but a church would. And then a number of other smaller groups, the Eulenspiegel Society, which was a BDSM discussion group, the only group that the vestry, the lay decision-making body of the church was really uncomfortable about them continuing to stay there because of BDSM, bondage, discipline, and sadomasochism, feeling uncomfortable with that as a form of sexual expression. Even though it was just a discussion group, they only stayed there for a couple of weeks. That was a lot, y'all. You're like, whoa, that was a piece. Okay, and then 4 of New York's first 5 gay religious groups started in this space. The Church of the Beloved Disciple, which was an independent Catholic congregation. The Metropolitan Community Church of New York, which Roy Burchard, again, was a part. Congregation Beit Simchat Torah, which is a gay synagogue. And the Gay Episcopal Fellowship, which was a service organized through the church itself, beginning in 1973, that later dovetailed with Integrity, which became the national sort of advocacy and LGBT outreach in the Episcopal Church. The one group that didn't meet there, religious group, Dignity, was in the Jesuit Center. So they had a separate space where they were meeting. So I'll say, Holy Apostles was providing space for these groups. The movements, now I have to go back to what I was saying. This was a critical period of movement growth, as the existing homophile organizations that were around before Stonewall were expanding. There were new groups starting up, the gay liberation groups, that were also getting started. And it was a moment when these groups were expanding from small membership-defined gatherings to more openly gay-identified public meetings at events, and that required a different kind of real estate. The movement's shift to this more public identity involved very different kinds of spaces. So some of that space for the Gay Liberation Front was supplied by Alternate University, which was a leftist event space in the West Village. There are also a handful of other civic spaces, such as political clubs that were occasionally available. And there were also other Protestant churches that opened up their space, and those included Washington Square United Methodist Church, which was known for its peace activism in particular, which was located in Washington Square, down in the Village. Judson Memorial hosted a lot of women's liberation events, as well as avant-garde art and theater. St. Peter's Episcopal Church, which was not that far from Holy Apostles, a little bit after Holy Apostles started opening its space, also had some events in their gym. But among these options, Holy Apostles was the most reliable answer for the gay movement's needs for meeting and event space. And I've given you that whole list of these groups that started there. So finding out about this church-based gay community center really surprised me. And it surprised me because I knew about the Stonewall Riots. As a researcher working in queer history, I had read through documentation and commentary by scholars about this incident, and it is one of the most well-documented and well-commented on events. It's kind of frightening sometimes to come in with a slightly different angle about the history of the Stonewall Riots because it is so well addressed by so many different people. So I'd read the scholarly debates. Was it actually the first riot? No. Did it start the LGBT movement? Also no. I mean, there are all kinds of things, all kinds of questions about the way that the firsts about Stonewall have overstated its actual influence. I'd also read the popular debates about the Stonewall Riots. And again, that popular narrative about this has really emerged through the memory making of the Stonewall Riots through the celebration of Pride, which began the first year after the riots in 1970. And those questions have focused on things like who threw the first brick. And it turns out that that's a hard one to answer. But the debate has helped to lift up the participation of Black and Latinx queens, such as Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, who both founded the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionary, even as, like, when you sort through the details, it's not exactly clear when and where these two individuals were part exactly of what was happening that night. And in some ways, that focus in the popular narratives on who threw the first brick individualizes the history of the riots to focus on exceptional individuals in a way that fails to see or takes out from your perspective the focus on how much it was a collective action and especially a collective occupation of the streets outside the bar as insurgent gay space. So with all those riots, I knew a lot about the Stonewall Riots. I had no idea that the Stonewall-era gay organizations were meeting in the same church. In marked contrast to the useful past of the riots, the history of Holy Apostles and other church-based meeting places have remained largely unmarked, absent the kind of attention that would note something as memorable. And so a good question is, why did this space matter? What we're looking at here is one of the participants in the Gay Liberation Front, Zazu Nova, who was also one of the participants and founders of the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. She is sitting on a table in Holy Apostles Parish Hall. There's very little about this space that would signal that it is a church. There's a little bit of cues there with the Tudor-style glass. You know, sometimes that looks a little churchy. But for the most part, this space is much less marked as religious space than would be the sanctuary. So paying attention to why this space matters in some ways means looking at the walls, looking at the unmarked part even of the photographic record from meetings and events, looking and paying attention to what would it have been about the particular layout and et cetera that would have made this space attractive. So when I've talked more with some of the activists and organizers who were part of the movement's meeting here, one of the things they've also said is, on one level, the role of church space is not surprising in the context of movements taking place in the 60s and early 70s. Anecdotally, members of the Gay Liberation Front and other activist organizations were connected to the larger milieu of leftists organizing, like the Young Lords, and pretty much saw that everyone was meeting in churches. Progressive-leaning Protestant churches and a few liberal Catholic churches, depending on the issues, served as both organizing spaces and protest stages for the broader movements of the New Left. And in many cases, the relationship was hospitable, with ministers and congregations hosting or leasing at subsidized rates the space for regular meetings of peace organizers, women's liberation movement, tenants' rights, Black Power, Young Lords, and other groups. Church spaces were repurposed as freedom schools, as sites for speak-outs and other activist events. So there's a level at which, of course, gay liberation was meeting in the church. At the same time, even in context, this space-sharing practice is really intriguing. The activist organizations of the post-Stonewall movement in New York were notoriously critical of religion, the Gay Liberation Front and the Gay Activist Alliance in particular. And very few of the folks that I talked to, and even in the records at that time, they were not looking for church space itself as an ideal space. Church space ended up being the most suitable and the most affordable within a set of limited options. Stonewall-era organizers in New York did not have the option to meet at bars or many other public venues, which are at that point, a point again, like under sort of already seen by many activists as oppressive spaces because of their connection to mafia and syndicate ownership. So the ideal space for all of these groups was a place of our own, and newsletters of the Gay Liberation Front, the Gay Activist Alliance, and other groups that regularly met at Holy Apostles kept an eye out for what could be that space of our own. But it wasn't until 1972, when the Gay Activist Alliance started renting what was called the Firehouse, that gay-operated space became regularly available for large public events. So Holy Apostles Parish Hall, in the meantime, was a good enough space during those critical years of movement growth. But Holy Apostles also, in some ways, was making do. This is from 1880, which is, take a moment to absorb the bossiness of this church space, fixed pews. Holy Apostles was sort of retroactively Gothicized it was built prior to the neo-Gothic revival in church spaces. But in many ways, it sort of added a larger chancel and added transepts. So there's a lot in this space that, well, I'll say it really signals fancy church, and it signals the kind of taste culture of white, elite, Anglo-Protestant taste at that moment in New York. So it's notable to see what the intentionality of the space was from its history in the 19th century in comparison to the congregation it became in the 50s and 60s. Yeah. The parish that shouldered the upkeep of the buildings that these gay groups were meeting in was worlds away from the Anglo-Protestant elites that had commissioned these structures a century earlier. when the congregation was, as one of its own rectors termed it, a bastion of white Anglo-Saxon Protestantism. Through the 1950s and 1960s, this corner of North Chelsea became increasingly Puerto Rican, African American, and Afro-Caribbean. The neighborhood was also transformed during those years by a series of urban renewal projects, which only barely spared the structure of the church itself in the process of so-called slum clearance that demolished existing tenement buildings to make way for new housing developments. The congregation was also transformed because of these neighborhood changes, and with the adamant outreach of a former rector who was a white man during this time, this parish became thoroughly racially integrated with a strong lay leadership that was about, and I'll say what I use for my numbers, there are different pieces of information about demographics, but about half Black and Afro-Caribbean, about half white with a smaller number of Latinx or Hispanic parishioners. So this was the congregation that opened the doors of this church to New York's gay movement. What I'm going to talk about in the next series of slides is 3 different incidents where conflicts or questions about the use of space came up. And what I think they show is both how the church space was important as the infrastructure for community building, and also the set of precipitating changes that take place when new bodies enter the spaces for which they were not imagined or intended. The first of these was the very first sort of ongoing gay movement, gay organization to hold events in the church, and that was the West Side Discussion Group, which again was an older homophile organization that in the 1960s was using a private club, which was sort of a way of managing the problem of gay public space as public space, right? Was using a private club that could hold about 50 to 60 people comfortably. And at this point, like through the summer of 1969, they were growing and expanding to regularly have an attendance of about 100. So they approached the rector of Holy Apostles at the time, Father Weeks, who then facilitated a conversation with the vestry to hold their regular discussions and dances in the parish hall. And I have the vestry minutes, which are really interesting. And what I can say, I mean, vestry minutes, like all minutes, tell you only part of the story, right? But there was an initial meeting with the vestry in the summer of '69, for which there are no records. They're like, oh, our secretary wasn't there for that meeting, so we don't have any minutes. But we remember that we all said no to the dancing part. The discussion part's fine. So that was approved according to this recollection at a later meeting of that earlier meeting. But in this later meeting, with a gathering of groups from the leadership of the church, what happened was the West Side Discussion Group came in like probably super dressed, looking very respectable, and convinced them that this was going to be a completely decorous event. They should bring their wives. It would be fine, and they would pay. Then they actually paid more than a nominal fee. They were ready to pay almost. They ended up paying almost $200 a month for the regular use of that church space. So they had their regular discussion series, so different topics every week, followed by a social hour and a dance. And this is a picture from the gay newspaper that fall about this new dance scene that was now happening in Holy Apostles Parish Hall. And the radical thing that was possible was not only was this not a gay bar, but this also was a space where couples could dance together. So the West Side Discussion Group swings. And at this point, keep in mind, there are multiple buildings that belong to the church. This is the parish hall. The parish hall is the deliberately multi-purpose counterpart to the more sacred service sort of structured space of the sanctuary. So the parish hall is sort of in some ways less sacred than the sanctuary, and in many ways was already a multi-purpose space. There had been dances held there before. So there's the question about who could be in what space and how could it be used is a question that comes up again and again and again with these different groups that are addressing questions about using the space. And congregation members' deliberations over this and other space sharing agreements focused on how to manage the brick and mortar of the building. But the concerns underlying this talk about space addressed questions of stigma, questions about respectability, what parts of the church building could be used, what parts could not be entered, what kinds of interactions and practices could take place in the available space. So what we talk about when we talk about space addresses all kinds of things about what kinds of bodily actions and interactions can be facilitated in the social spaces of the church. And then there's also who else could know about what happened in the space. So fast forwarding a few years, and I'll say in June of 1970, the Church of the Beloved Disciple began holding their Sunday services in the sanctuary of Holy Apostles, and even the use of the sanctuary for this gay church was a question that also brought controversy and discussion, and ultimately the lay leaders of the church and the rector agreed that yes, and they had been there for nearly a year when the New York Post reported on a union ceremony, a Bobby Jean Sanchez, who's the shorter woman in the front in the tuxedo, and Joan Kearse, who is wearing the wedding dress. They are joined in a holy union officiated by Father Robert Clement, Church of the Beloved Disciple. And this question really, who could know about it, was really at the center of the congregational discussion about this very incident and the fact that there was a reporter involved. The fact that this made the newspaper. And all kinds of things came up in this reporting in addition to the fact that the Church of the Beloved Disciple was holding services in the church, that this Holy Union service had taken place. Also mentioned was that the rector of Holy Apostles was also very quietly, up until that point, not quietly after that point, holding ceremonies of holy friendship for also same-sex couples, very quietly taking place. And here again, the questions centered around who could know about it, and ultimately the decision of the congregation in response to this. The conversation, was it okay that the union ceremony happened? Yes. Was it okay that it happened in the sanctuary? That's not exactly the problem. Is it okay that it was held in front of the altar? That's less the problem. Is it okay to invite the press? Not okay. And that was where the line was drawn. But even that discussion, again, new bodies doing different things in a space for which that space was not intended, brings up a conversation that had to be had, right? And it does seem that the conversation itself sort of had members of the congregation, this is somewhat guesswork because it's hard to know how people are changing their mind in process, but we do see how the space itself became pretty directly led to important transformations in the Episcopal Church as a denomination. And what you're looking at here is a meeting of the Gay Liberation Front. I think it's a meeting of the Gay Liberation Front women, and I'm actually not sure where it's taking place. But the person in the back with glasses and wearing black is Ellen Barrett, who is another person who drove into New York to join the gay revolution, in her case, from New Mexico, after being in a convent in New Mexico, reading reports of this revolution taking place, this gay revolution, drove to New York. And she has a memory of, and talked about this in the mid-1970s. She has a memory of attending her first meeting of the Gay Liberation Front and meeting this large man, kindly man wearing a clerical collar, who reached his hand out to her and greeted her at her first meeting of the Gay Liberation Front. And Father Weeks was the rector of Holy Apostles, and Barrett recalls that the first time she entered the doors to Holy Apostles Parish Hall, Father Weeks shook her hand, and what she remembered was that this was how she was introduced to the church's ministry to homosexuals, by this open showing of respect by the rector of the church. And Barrett recounts this journey later at a point when she is then directing, or one of the leaders in Holy Apostles' own gay ministry, which again started in 1973. And if you don't know where this goes, Barrett was the first openly lesbian, openly gay person to be ordained in the Episcopal denomination. And that ordination service took place in January of 1977, and she, as well as Annette Rourke, were ordained among the first women as well to be ordained in the Episcopal Church. And I won't attempt to decode this map behind me. This is in Ellen Barrett's own bulletin. So this is the ordination of the sacred priesthood. The bulletin in the back has a little insert that instructed all the participants in the service, like where their bodies needed to be at various points, how they needed to move as they redirected, the service and participated in the service of Eucharist. The image shows the planned routes and locations for this service, with the lines and arrows directing the new priest, the bishop, and other participating priests into their places around the altar in preparation for the consecration of the Eucharist. So the question of women's ordination, and with it gay ordination, addresses at least in part which bodies can serve as spiritual authorities, and particularly in this moment in the consecration of Christ's body in the practice of the Eucharist. And this image highlights how the sacred presence of the Eucharist ritual takes place materially in physical space as an intimate co-dwelling of bodies and objects. The controversy that followed Barrett's ordination highlighted again how the gay movement's practices of coming out, of publicity, challenged again the material spatial issue of who could know as key to the ordination of openly gay candidates. And the bishop at the time, which we now know, had relationships with men throughout his life. There's even more recent revelations about some of those being harassing and predatory. But he was the bishop who ordained Ellen Barrett, and in his publications and communication about this, emphasized again and again and again that the one thing Ellen Barrett did that was different was be honest. And the fact that folks knew that she was gay was the thing that made her ordination different. So I'll just say a few things in closing. This is a photo from Washington Square Methodists, where one of the Gay Liberation Front meetings was taking place. It's a nice one. It's amazing to think about, right? This is 1960. This probably was 1960. No, this might have been 1970. Like, my hunch is that this was June of 1970. So celebrating the first Stonewall Riots anniversary. 1970. Holy Apostles was not actually an exception. I mean, I'm telling this story with a focus on New York because it connects so profoundly to what we know about the Stonewall Riots. But it was one of many congregations that opened their doors to stigmatize queer groups at a moment when space was vitally needed and hard to find. And there are a number of historians and activists and folks who are members of churches that are digging into their own histories to find some of this earlier history, which in many cases has not been part of the memory, the marked memory of what we should know about, because it precedes, in many cases, the openly gay sort of candidates who spoke out, and even some of Barrett's own involvement in Holy Apostles has not been as marked a part of her story to ordination, right? And that's true in many other cases of candidates to ordination, of same-sex union ceremonies, that there's a quieter history of the congregational level of support and involvement. And that is in so many places, that history of spiritual support or spiritual inclusion follows up on an earlier history of space-based or place-based inclusion, where local gay groups, LGBT groups, were meeting in spaces. It is not uncommon in many, if not most, of the places of the US and elsewhere for one of the first gay community centers to be meeting in a church building. And we just don't know, in many cases, about that earlier history, because again, it hasn't been marked. The Holy Apostles' example raises questions, again, about how we remember the history of queerness and religion, and how the space, the material spaces, are part of that history as a way to especially counter that abstracted, decontextualized story of opposition. But there's also some very specific historical questions I have as well. I mean, I'm so curious about how many of these congregations may have been so-called transitional churches and predominantly communities of color, neighborhoods that had been marked by white flight that then had, in their own cases, new bodies who had different kinds of attachments to the buildings that they were now shepherding. I also wonder how many other church spaces and gay meeting places led to denominational and institutional change. How does it change the picture of entrenched institutional opposition to map out the religious infrastructure that provided some of the support for the gay movement, the queer movement, to emerge? And to circle back to Martha Shelley's questions from the very beginning, it raises again in moments when churches are struggling in their own spaces with questions: what to do with a church? What do we do with this building? And how can and how might and how do religious spaces continue to find ways to use their facilities as infrastructure for community building? And how can that be even more part of the conversation? So thank you very much. I hope you have questions, because I want to talk and hear your thoughts. Yeah.
The floor is open.
Thank you. This is so great. I learned so much from this. I was just so fascinated by this parish hall being a kind of seedbed for so many Christian and also Jewish congregations and denominations. And I'm wondering if you could just keep thinking more about the lack of religious iconography in that space that makes it not too Protestant or Catholic and not even Christian, that makes it possible to host a synagogue. And then, when the one community comes upstairs, and just think about the different kind of religiosities and codings and what makes possible different communities being able to meet there.
Absolutely. And so one quick tidbit: the congregation Beit Simchat Torah ended up coming back to Holy Apostles some 10 years after they left in the mid-1970s, and then at least 10 years later came back when they were looking for space. And they did begin to hold services in the sanctuary, but you have to transform the space to cover up the iconography. And it's only been recently that CBST now has their own space and their own building that is intentionally purpose-built to facilitate their services and high holy days and all of it. But yeah, the question about the parish hall, one of the things I've been thinking about the parish hall is in many ways it is the incubator for much of progressive secularism, as they purpose-built secular space to accompany the religiously sort of the particular ways that sanctuary space is really limited for what you can do with it, right? So in order to hold the sanctuary space as holy and set apart and distinct, in many congregations, and especially those that have the funds to do it, there's a multi-purpose space that, all of the building advice emphasizes: imagine anything that you may want to do with it, and try to be as capacious as possible in the way that you leave that space open for doing everything from folk dancing to meals to theater to bowling to, the advice into the 20th century, right? Was really just make it as flexible as possible. So sanctuaries have been a little less usable as space, but parish halls, church social halls, church basements have incubated all kinds of things. Theaters, social movements continue to be places for social movements. Many of the first daycares were being offered in church spaces. So there's all kinds of ways that if we think about the growth of much of the sort of secular, post-Protestant, progressive, much of that has come out of origins within church spaces. And that's probably particularly true in cities, but I imagine that's also true elsewhere as well, where it does become a community center that's useful for all kinds of things.
Thank you. I, too, learned a great deal from this. And I'm, it's it's also sort of full of memories. Oh, thank you. So I'm intrigued. I mean, it's sort of like I may be bouncing beyond what you want to really talk about, but because this is kind of bringing me back in time to being in, parish halls and all of the things that took place there, at least in my upbringing, that was the church basement and the church hall were kind of women's space. Because of meals and because of youth groups and because of, so the ways that, at least in where it's bringing me is, men used it too. It's not that it wasn't used, but I'm just wondering if there's a way too of thinking about the spaces in largely patriarchal church structures where women did a lot of things and feminized the whole sort of ways of gender non-normativity that do you have any thoughts about that? I don't know if I'm going further than that, but just to think about also the gendering of various church spaces.
Yeah, I appreciate the point in particular of the way that parish halls and church social halls was more feminized space because of the way it's community space, children's space, and that was true for Holy Apostles. The pieces that I have of their history from the 60s and even into the 50s is not only a history of, that was breakfast, that was the place, community outreach for meals, all of that, where women's leadership mattered. And in particular, in this case, Black women's leadership mattered. And there's really important, one of the questions I've been asking a number of the there's not a whole bunch of folks who are alive who remember Holy Apostles from the 60s and 70s, but the phrase mothers of the church has been one I've heard from a number of folks even later, especially in talking about some of the women who were still alive in the 80s and onward, right, but who were there making meals, watching kids, and it's another example of church leadership in a feminized role, a particular kind of authority, but a history in particular of how Black churches and the role of Black women as mothers of the church in particular. Who remembers that term and who uses that term is another. It sort of points to the important ways that Holy Apostles carried a legacy of Black and Caribbean Episcopal and Anglican traditions into, the later history of the congregation is that it becomes increasingly white and increasingly gentrified. So finding when even that Blacker history of the church is visible and remembered and marked is a question that I've been asking folks as well. So that's back to your, the feminized space, who's taking the minutes and typing up the minutes of the things that I'm reading as records, who is making sure that they're kept. Those are pieces where women are directing that history. And it was in 1969 that Holy Apostles had its first woman on the vestry board as a monumentous thing, formally in leadership. But much of that leadership, even at that point and after that point was in that kind of informal role.
Well, I'm thinking there's sort of no way to know, but could that gendering of space have anything to do with the openness to, you know,
Why it's okay to use that space as opposed to the sanctuary.
Or, you know, that partly it's more of a secularized space, but
Yeah.
also it's, you know, maybe it's also a place. Anyway, I'm just wondering if there's an element there that would have to be speculation. Unless you can actually get people to
Yeah,
describe it. But
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a good question. Thank you.
Unfortunately, we have to end on that question. However, there is reception time, and Heather will be here for a bit before we whisk her off to the next event. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.